here. He says, start to cough this weather. Now, if you can't hear me, let me know, because it's awful to sit there and not hear. I think I speak loudly enough, but sometimes people say, oh, could you lower your voice? So let me know. Yeah. You know, it's kind of interesting about museum visitors. If they're adults, they just barely get both feet through the door. When someone, usually a woman, will ask a question. Do you have any idea what that question is? Yes, don't you? Exactly. Where's the restroom? But if we have kids come, they don't even get both feet through the door. When someone, and in this case it's usually a boy, will ask a question. Where are the dinosaurs? Well, we're not that kind of museum. But I'm always tempted to say, you're looking at her. I don't do that because I know that would confuse everybody. And besides, it's not a very complimentary term. But in a sense, I suppose it does fit because I have been here longer than anybody. Longer than any of the other docents and volunteers, way longer than any of the staff. This year, all year, we have been celebrating the 100th birthday of the museum. I want you to know, I have not been here the entire 100 years. But I'm working on it. I have been an active docent here for 38 years, 4 months, 2 weeks, 6 days, and almost 4 hours. So that's why I sometimes am tempted to say I'm the dinosaur. But also, that's why I've been asked to tell you about the history of the museum. And I will do that in so much as I know it. But I'm going to put a heavy emphasis on the Docent Volunteer Council because that's where my involvement has been. That's what I know best. And that's where most of you will be involved. The story of the museum actually goes farther back than 100 years because the museum's collection of artifacts stemmed from the personal collection of one man. That man was Dr. Cephas Bard. He was a young Civil War veteran who came to Ventura from Pennsylvania in 1868. And in doing that, he was following in the footsteps of his older brother, Thomas. Now, probably most of you have heard the name Thomas Bard. If not, you will somewhere along the line. But I'm not really going to talk about him other than to say that during his day, he was one of, if not the, most influential people in the county. And he also has the distinction of being the first, and so far the only, United States Senator to come from Ventura County. He was elected in the year 1900, and he chose to serve just one term. But it's his brother Cephas that concerns us when we tell the story of the museum. He set up a practice here right away, and his office and his drugstore were right across the street. And by the way, if you want to meet him, he's standing at the foot of the stairs that go up to the research library, right inside the door. Now, he's not in the flesh, and of course this is ghost season, but he's not a ghost, but I guess we could say he's in the bronze, because it's a bronze bust that was made in the year that he died, 1902. And it was a gift from the so-called Bard babies. These were all the babies he delivered in his 45 years of being in practice here in Ventura. He was a man of many interests, medicine, of course, but biology, botany, archaeology, anthropology, history, and he seems to have been particularly interested in the Native American cultures. A lot of his patients were Chumash Indians. Many of them were poor. And all too often, they just simply couldn't pay him full hard cash. So sometimes they would do something for him or give him food from their gardens. But sometimes he'd say, I'll tell you what, I'll deliver your baby, fix your broken arm, stitch up that cut in your leg, whatever it was, in exchange for, how about that sombrero? I really like that little basket. I could use those spurs. Well, by the time he died in 1902, he had accumulated around 300 items in lieu of payment. And of course, I have no way of knowing if this happened, but I can well imagine that there came the day when Mrs. Bard said to him, Cephas, you have to get these things out of the house. I mean, who wants a two-headed lamb in the parlor? And as far as I know, we still have that two-headed lamb because it was on display not too long ago. And speaking of Mrs. Bard, I want to hear a little historical gossip. Well, the two brothers were married to sisters. So there was a very close relationship between the two families until Cephas and Clara were divorced. Now that was in 1889. And you know, at that time, in a little town like Ventura was at that time, that was pretty scandalous. Well, to compound the scandal, he remarried a few months later. So after that, two families were quite as cozy as they had been. And apparently neither the current wife or the ex-wife wanted that collection, or apparently not his son or daughter either from the first marriage. So in his will, he bequeathed that collection, and it's an eclectic collection. Try saying that 3 times real fast. Eclectic collection. And so he willed it to the county of Ventura. Well, with the hope that someday there would be a place to put them on display for the public to see. Well, at first there was no such place. So they were stored in a little adobe building that, as far as I can figure out, was right out here where our parking lot is. Well then, in 1913, and here's when 100 years comes in, the county courthouse was completed. That's that beautiful white classical building on Poli Street at the top of California Street. And, oh, by the way, this is just a little sidebar. That was not the first county courthouse. There were 2, well, sort of 2 before that. The immediate predecessor was right here behind the museum on the other side of Santa Clara. It was a brick building. And the jail was also there. The first one, after the county was formed, was right down here on the southwest corner of Main Street and Palm Street. It was in an existing building. It was on the 2nd floor. On the 1st floor was a saloon and dance hall. That was one of 17 saloons in the space of 3 blocks on Main Street. So this was a wide open town at one time. And I've often wondered which floor witnessed the most heated arguments. First floor where the saloon was, or the 2nd floor where the court proceedings were taking place. Anyway, back to 1913. It was decided then to take Dr. Bard's collection from the little adobe building up to California Street, or Poli Street, and they were put on display in what came to be called the Chamber of Commerce room. Well, once people began to look at those, that prompted them to donate to the collection. By 1950, the walls of that room were about to burst. So it was decided that it was high time to have a real museum just below the courthouse, and of course that's our city hall now. On the west side of Upper California Street was the Sheridan family home. And the two Sheridan brothers, Saul and Ed, decided that would make a good museum. Well, the house was old. It didn't really lend itself to museum purposes, so it was torn down. But interestingly, they left the front porch with a big, old, beautiful wisteria vine growing over. And then they built just a plain rectangular building that one story up against that porch, and that became the museum. It was just one big room filled with what might be called visual storage. Rows of exhibit cases filled with a variety of artifacts, and along the walls were some of the bigger items. It was given the name of Pioneer Museum, and that was taken from an organization called the Pioneer Society, which was made up of people who had lived in the county at the time of its formation in 1873. Well, by 1950, and by the way, Dr. Bard, and I don't think I mentioned, he was the first American physician in the area. He was also the first president of the Pioneer Society. He and his brother were overachievers. They were first this, first that, first the other thing. But anyway, by 1950, there weren't many of those original people still walking around. So it was decided to disband what was left of it, that group, and start a new organization called the Ventura County Historical Society. And that took place the next year, 1951. Now, fast forward to 1975. By this time, there were plans to build a new museum at a different location. And Richard Esparza was hired as the executive director. He was aware of a growing trend among museums of having a corps of volunteers called docents. Now, this is at a time when that word was unfamiliar to most people. Now, some people may have known the original meaning, going back to ancient Greece, which meant an unpaid lecturer or teacher, particularly on the university level. But in the mid-1970s, there was another meaning, and today it's the number one meaning, and that is a volunteer educator or tour guide in a museum setting. Now, it wouldn't have to be a museum such as this. Could be a zoo, a park, a historical building, so forth. And Richard Esparza thought, when this new building, whenever it should come about, ought to have such an organization. Why not get them started right away so that when the museum materialized, they could hit the ground running? So in May of 1975, the Docent Council was born. And I want to take just a little jog here and explain something. We now call it the Docent Volunteer Council. Well, that's redundant because a docent is a volunteer. But this is another trend that's happening now in museums to separate by name and training only. Volunteers work in various museum services. Docents work in education. But it's just, as I said, in name and training only. Otherwise, we are parts of a whole. There is no hierarchy here. One is not better than the other, and I really want to stress that point. Anyway, back to 1975. At the beginning, our membership was limited to 12, for the simple reason that that's how many chairs we had. They had partitioned off one back corner of that big room, brought in some odds and ends of tables and chairs. That's where we worked. We worked every Tuesday morning from 9 to 12. And and we paid dearly for our volunteer efforts. See, at that time, parking in downtown Ventura, especially near the courthouse, was limited to 1 hour. If you were lucky and you didn't mind walking 3 or 4 blocks, you might be able to find a 2-hour parking space. Well, we'd get busy working. We'd forget to go move our cars, and we all ended up with hefty parking tickets from time to time. Our sole job at that point was to begin the enormous job of accessioning every item ever donated to the museum, starting with Dr. Bart's collection. We researched every item, measured it, described it in writing, and then gave each one its very own special number. And let me tell you, you have not left until you have attempted to put a 6, 7, 8-digit number in ink on the inside of the back of a little campaign button under the pin. Any of you ever have those little Red Cross buttons the size of a dime, white with the Red Cross? Well, we had some of those, but also a lot of the other buttons were that size. To say that was a challenge didn't even come close. But anyway, we did not give tours of the Pioneer Museum. But interestingly, in October of that first year, we were asked to do tours of the Alevas Adobe at the east end of town. We did that for at least 5 years, after we were in this building, until they came up with their own crew of docents. In December of 1975, ground was broken for this building. In June of 1977, the doors were opened to the public for the first time, with a brand new name over the door, Ventura County Historical Museum. There have been 2 name changes since then, Ventura County Museum of History and Art, and currently the Museum of Ventura County. That first summer, and in fact all that first year, it was so exciting, so exhausting. And I'm not exaggerating when I say you could not get from the lobby to this room sometimes. There were so many people in here. And we were inundated with requests for tours, both adult and student tours. And that continued all that first year. When we were at the Pioneer Museum, we had a staff of 2. Shortly before moving in here, they hired an artist, Mike Cole. And then some years later, they rehired him briefly, and he did this